Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Jasper Schipperijn, and I'm the president of ISPA, the International Society for Physical Activity and Health. And on behalf of ISPA, I'm very pleased to see that so many of you have joined us for today's webinar. You can see that we're already at 250 participants and still rising. So what we'll do today is you will hear more about why every move counts, or in other words, we will hear more about the science behind the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior. We will hear more today about the new WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior, and especially we'll hear more about the science behind all these guidelines. As many of you know, there has been a very large team of scientists behind the guidelines. 27 experts have been working on the guideline development group. A lot of other researchers have helped with reviewing the evidence. Experts have been evaluating the different papers and reviewing, and all of that has resulted in the 2020 WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior. Today we'll hear more about the science behind the guidelines. We'll hear more about the process that has gone on behind the guidelines. But we will also try to set the agenda for discussion and future research. And the program today is as follows. First, we'll hear from Dr. Fiona Bull and Dr. Juana Willumsen from the Physical Activity Unit at WHO. They will introduce the guidelines. They will talk about the process behind it, show us some of the outputs, and talk about the road ahead. And as you might also be aware of, the guideline development group has also led the development of a large number of peer-reviewed papers lie behind these guidelines. And what we have also done is invite the 3 editors-in-chief from the 3 key journals within our field, the British Journal of Sports Medicine, the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity, and the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. The 3 editors will join us today and present their take on the main messages in the papers that have been recently published in their journals or will soon be published. After the first 4 main presentations, there will be a question and answer session, and that session will primarily function through the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. We will not be keeping track of what is happening in the chat function, so if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom there. The questions will be partly answered via the Q&A function and partly live after the 4 presentations. Also feel very free to engage via social media. Please use the hashtag #EveryMoveCounts and please tag @ISPA. And with that, I would like to hand over to our first speakers of this evening, Dr. Fiona Bull and Dr. Juana Willumsen from WHO.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jasper. And a very good evening, good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining this ISPA WHO webinar. And I invite Juana, who I believe is already beginning to share the screen. And it's a great pleasure to co-present this introduction to the seminar with Juana from WHO to introduce the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behaviour. But before we start, I'd like to extend thanks to ISPA and to the leadership and the proactive move by ISPA to establish this and schedule this webinar this evening. already just 1 week out from the launch, and to engage with so many of you. So a very big thanks to all of those joining, and the many who've subscribed, perhaps also wishing to get the recording of this. So thank you, Jasper, thank you, Karen, and thank you to the ISPA leadership team, but also thank you to the other panel members, because it's a really great pleasure to share the stage with you as editors, as members of the guideline development group, as leading scientists in this field. So what we'd like to do is take you through some of the guidelines and introduce, and we're doing a double act with Juana also on the controls, but we'll go to the next slide. And it's absolutely a great pleasure to present the next slide and see that we are in the past tense. We have launched the guidelines, and for quite some time, many of you will have been hearing about them, participating in different phases and steps of the process. And certainly from our perspective, we've been talking about them coming, but it's great pleasure this evening to be saying we did it. Collectively, we've launched, and the guidelines exist from last week. And of course, we are absolutely pleased to fulfill an ambition that is to launch in the 6 UN languages at the time of launch. Not always easy. So very pleased that you can see the cover pages there. And of course, all the documents that you'll be introduced to in further detail as we go through. But let's just pause before we get into the science, as Jasper has indicated, and reflect and enjoy the last week. And if we could go to the next slide. We did launch through a webinar, and you really showed your interest and anticipation of the guidelines as a global community on physical activity, as a scientific community, but also many out there who are looking to implement, to advocate, and to work collectively in this field. We were very delighted with the turnout, and I really appreciate Juana's put together this slide, because we had representation from 151 countries and territories live. That's of the 2,600 participants. I might also add that there was 1,900 participants by 90 minutes. So we know you've been waiting for these guidelines, and it's a great milestone for the field of physical activity. But in addition, and we'll see on the next slide, that we also had lots more coverage. And this is early days. We're only a week out, but we know there's been over 3,000 media articles across some of the leading media outlets, which we know are continuing to snowball with other coverage. Just this week, yesterday, BBC Health Check. We know in many countries in radio and TV, there was coverage. And we know that also members of the guideline group were supporting that. So many thanks to that. This is important for us to make sure people know it happened. So we succeeded in the mainstream media, but the next slide also shows how we were doing with all of the assets and the materials we produced. And I hope it was a delight, perhaps even a surprise for WHO. But we put together a video, Every Move Counts, and it has gone quite crazy. So people are enjoying it, people are getting the message, people are enjoying the positive, but also inclusive visuals, and of course the music. We've had coverage across many of the leading platforms, attracting and speaking to different age groups, etc. Our website covered the launch for the 24-hour, 36-hour window, and of course is still live with a new website for physical activity. And as counted today, 300 million impressions. A thanks to you, and a really demonstration of where this field's going. Next slide, please, Juana. Just wait for that to tick over, because the guidelines represent a summary of science. But as all of you know, the dual agenda is to simplify into communication messages that make that science and the important contents accessible. And so in the summary, what we call at a glance, you'll see 6 messages, and you'll hear us repeat these. We actually introduced them on the launch day. We just headline them here for you, knowing that many of you have seen it. We know the science shows physical activity is good for hearts, bodies and minds. And all of you know that means the cardiovascular, the mental and cognitive health, and of course the other systems of the body, bone health and musculoskeletal. So we capture that in hearts, bodies and mind. We also know that that curvilinear relationship, dose response, is very strong and clear, more so for some outcomes, and any activity is better, is good, and more is better. And that led us to this sort of all movement counts, because it's not just in the sport or the transport or at home or work. And you've heard and you've seen the science is increasing, and we can be confident in talking about all domains. Next slide. And so this last three areas that will come visible to us in just a moment also emphasize an often forgotten recommendation that we want to bring forward in our main messages, and that is the value of muscle strengthening. The science has got stronger, and you'll hear about that, I'm sure, from some of the other speakers, that the relationship is there for undertaking muscle strengthening. The sedentary, you're going to know it's new. Of course, it was important and it was included. And then the summary is that there is now evidence of that interplay, that relationship between sedentary and physical activity. 6 main messages. But what I'd like to do now is go on to the next slide, and let's go a little bit deeper into how did we get to these guidelines. And so we'd like to share with you some of the process, fill in the gaps, really focus on what's new, 5 or 6 points, and then tell you what are the next steps and direct you towards the products and resources that are available for all of us, all of you, to access free from our website, use and amplify. And that's going to be a main message from us. And I think it's at this point I invite Juana to take over.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So I just wanted to give a little outline, a brief outline of the process that WHO undertook to develop these guidelines. WHO have a very rigorous process that applies to all guidelines that we develop as an organization. And we followed that, obviously, and looked to capitalize and make the most of the recent work that has been undertaken to review the evidence from the last decade on physical activity. So we identified reviews that were recent, that were comprehensive, that had used a grade or a similar process as is required by WHO, and then looked to update these large systematic reviews. And the reviews that we identified for children and adolescents were those conducted in Canada by Poitras and Carson on physical activity and sedentary behaviour, and updated for the Australian guidelines in 2019 by Tony Oakley and his group. For adults and older adults, the main source was the scientific report of the Physical Activity Guideline Advisory Group for the US guidelines, PAGAC, which was a large systematic update of physical activity and sedentary behaviour from 2008 through to 2016. And for physical activity during pregnancy and the postpartum period, there were 12 systematic reviews undertaken for the 2019 Canadian guidelines, which also supplemented the PAGAG work. In addition, we had identified areas and outcomes that were not included in any of these reviews, and so commissioned special new reviews, in particular looking at occupational physical activity, the potential adverse effects of physical activity, and for older adults, focusing specifically on falls prevention, osteoporosis, and also frailty in older adults. We had chosen to include a set of recommendations for people living with chronic conditions, which I'll give more detail on later. But in addition to the usual chronic conditions of cancer, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes, a very strong point was made that for many people, particularly in low and middle income countries, are now living with HIV as a chronic condition, thanks to antiretroviral medication that has become widely available. And there may be concerns about people living with HIV engaging in physical activity. So we commissioned a special systematic review, particularly for this group. And in terms of the process that WHO undertakes to develop guidelines, we brought together a guideline development group composed of 27 experts, but also stakeholders and end users who will be using the guidelines so that we would have their voice at the table when reviewing the evidence. All that evidence that was gathered and updated were converted into grade tables so that the guideline development group could look at them and review the full evidence, draft recommendations, and we undertook an additional step of actually taking those to public consultation. So the draft recommendations were posted on the WHO website for a month. We received over 420 responses, quite detailed responses to those draft recommendations and some of the text that went around them, and undertook another step of revisiting the recommendations, making sure that we had inclusive language in all of those, and that we had addressed some of the issues that had been brought up during that public consultation. In addition, WHO guidelines in their final form undergo peer review. So 7 other experts were identified and they reviewed and gave us their feedback on the final guidelines. The final step is that WHO has a guidelines review committee, and this is a broad group throughout the organization across all regions of WHO who have the final say and review the guideline to ensure that all these steps have been applied and that the process has been very rigorous. In addition to that, we knew that the next step is actually probably one of the most important, getting these guidelines beyond a document and actually used and adopted by countries. To date, less than 80 countries have their own national guidelines, and we really would like these WHO guidelines to be something that can be used broadly across the world and improve that figure so that more than 80 countries in future have their own national guidelines. And to that end, we conducted 6 regional workshops virtually at different time zones, some of them not so comfortable, as Fiona and I will remember, and brought together we brought together 220 participants from 67 member states, which is a really broad reach. And I think we were enabled to do that because it was in a virtual format, to discuss adoption and then dissemination and communication of guidelines so that countries are already prepared and aware of these essential steps that follow on from the launch that we completed last week. Fiona, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Juana. A process that's rigorous and, as Juana has explained, following due process set out for all guidelines from WHO, and that's where the weight of the importance of the guidelines and the positioning within global policy is really getting traction. But thanks to everyone's work, thanks to the process unfolding, we have reached a point where the guidelines were passed and launched. And of course, we try in the guidelines to provide the global community with the scientific summary statements of how much physical activity improves health, with any caveats of risks or other matters. And of course, across the populations that you are all very familiar are covered by the guidelines now. We're not going to show lots of science and graphs. They are available, of course, by the supporting documents that informed, and Juana has outlined those as supporting documents, and indeed summarized in materials we'll introduce to you. But we're choosing just to pause for a moment on this slide, familiar to many of you, of course, because it just captures the fundamental relationship that more physical activity improves health, as you see on the y-axis. A variety of health outcomes could be put on that, and we'll speak to some of the new outcomes and the new evidence. We see, of course, that the guidelines apply to adults, to those with chronic disease, to pregnant and postpartum women, and for people with disability. And there is a recommended range. We focus on a single guideline around the aerobic amount of physical activity, because the last thing the field needs is 25, 35, 40 different guidelines for each outcome for each age group. But we are able to do that because there is convergence in the science about the amounts. There may not be the precision that we want on every relationship, but the guideline development group, the science that is there, informed the relationship you see summarized here. Every move counts, starting from the lowest level, the greatest benefits. More is beneficial. The risks are low until the higher and upper levels, and sedentary has detrimental, unfavorable health outcomes. Much lies behind this. I'm hoping that the other panel members will be digging a little deeper, because it's the papers in those journals that actually expand on the science. So for now, I think we're just introducing and reminding to you that the new evidence, the review of a decade worth of evidence since 2010, reaffirm, extend, and inclusive set of guidelines are the product. So next slide, let's take a moment to really highlight the new from 2020. And there are 4 or 5 to particularly speak to. In the youth, children and youth, those of you with a sharp eye will notice it's changed, and we now are talking about an average of 60 minutes per day. And that's largely a realignment of what the data actually says, plus new evidence from those studies using device-based measures. And we can see that, in fact, there is no exact precision of 60 minutes every day. It's on average that children should reach this threshold. The good news out of this main message is, of course, it aligns much more to the sort of typical variability that children and youth are going to have in how they accumulate physical activity. An important point that may get picked up in questions is, of course, this is not something that the physical education system has to provide. It's about society, the opportunities at home, at school, and in communities, and the sports sector to provide children, all children, with the opportunity to achieve this guideline. Secondly, in the adults area, again, you'll now see very clearly a range. The range that was shown in the previous graph is stated as the 150 to 300 minutes. Previously there, but emphasized in these new 2020 guidelines, because it is across that range, the variety of health benefits that we've spoken to, the reduction in risk of cancer, the reduction in risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and that more is better. And of course, above 300 minutes is also better. The second point related to the adults and older adults, and of course extrapolated and applied to the other groups, is that we have dropped the precision of stating that at least 10-minute bouts are necessary. Again, that was in the 2010 guidelines and many other national guidelines, but the evidence, supported now by device-based measures, show that in fact that is not necessary. All activity counts, and so we have removed that specification. The third emphasis and addition to the guidelines is for older adults, not just mentioning, again, that often forgotten guideline of strength and muscle training, is in fact the recommendation for multi-component physical activity, where in fact balance and strength are combined in activities, and all older adults, not just the frail or vulnerable, are recommended to conduct this types of physical activity on 3 or more days a week, particularly to reduce the risk of falls and injuries from falls. The fourth area where is new is there's more evidence on mental health outcomes. Not only more evidence, but the number of mental health outcomes has expanded from previously in 2010, just narrowed down into the prevention of symptoms of anxiety and depression. It's now established relationships with positive mental health, cognition, executive functioning, and of course, recognizing the benefits for learning and cognitive ability in children. Really powerful messages. One I hope there's going to be questions about, because how are we going to use that new evidence and these guidelines to really bring the mental health benefits into what is quite well established physical health benefits paradigm. And then lastly, the inclusion of new population groups you've heard mentioned, and I'm going to hand back to Juana to introduce and expand on this new element now. Thank you, Juana.
Thanks. So where the 2010 guidelines only addressed children, adolescents, adults and older adults, in the 2020 version, we have expanded that to include some key population groups. So namely pregnant women and postpartum women. And for them, the recommendation is that they do at least 150 minutes. But we also looked at the direct evidence for people living with chronic diseases. Those were cancer survivors, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and people living with HIV, as I mentioned earlier. And we looked for direct evidence for children, adolescents, and adults living with disability. In this last group, this was quite difficult because there is relatively little research for people living with disability outside rehabilitation. And so we were able to look at a limited number of impairments that these people may suffer from. But the expert opinion felt that the benefits of physical activity, not just the physical and mental health benefits, but also those in terms of social inclusion, were such that the broad guidelines for children, adolescents, and adults could be extended to those living with disabilities. And the direct evidence that we reviewed for people living with chronic conditions also indicated that the same range of physical activity was appropriate for them. And so the recommendations for each of these groups are actually the same as those for adults, older adults, and children and adolescents.
Thank you, Juana. So let us reach towards the end of our presentation by a moment on the new guideline on sedentary behaviour. This, of course, was requested by member states and in response to a growing body of evidence over the last decade. In 2010, it was too early. The committee involved in the 2010 guidelines felt there was not sufficient evidence for WHO to make a guideline. However, that's dramatically changed. Building on that evidence, building on the systematic reviews that were provided, the guideline development group advised WHO, and indeed the guideline now states, of course, that all ages should reduce sedentary behaviour. The WHO guidelines do not specify a specific threshold by which it is risky above or below. The decision and the appraisal of the evidence was it's insufficient to guide that threshold yet. However, the relationship between sedentary behaviour and unfavourable health outcomes is much clearer at the upper end. And therefore, there is the recommendation for those at the high end of sedentary behaviour, perhaps through work, and therefore not so much by choice, but by other lifestyle components. Those who accumulate high levels of physical activity are recommended to do higher amounts of physical activity to offset. This is very interesting and very important research that's really very much unfolding. And of course, the use of device-based measures is enabling us to understand both behaviours, sedentary and physical activity, much more sophisticated, much more detailed, and much more is still needed. But the 2020 guidelines, on the basis of the evidence included, the decisions and appraisal of that evidence, make 2 recommendations for adults, older adults, and other groups, and the single recommendation for youth. So new guidelines on sedentary behaviour. Let us look now, of course, at the outputs of what we've got for everyone to use. And so the next slide tells us, and you've seen it already, and I'll hand back to Juana just to guide you very briefly through what you can use and access. And it's important you know what's available for you. Juana.
Thank you. So the document on the right-hand side, which is currently available in all 6 UN languages, is an at a glance. It's a summary of the full guideline document in a more digestible form and includes all the graphics that we've shown you. The main document on the left in green is the full guideline report, and that really contains all the detail of the evidence that was reviewed by the guideline development group. The web annex, which is the smaller document in the middle with the yellow circle, that's only available online, and that runs to nearly 600 pages of grade evidence profiles. So really giving you the absolute detail on all the studies that were reviewed and all the evidence that was made available to the guideline development group. Those documents are available through the WHO website, but in addition, we have two other resources that are made publicly available and that you can access and use. The first is the Trello board, which contains all our multimedia assets. And we have a webinar recording of the webinar that we did last week. Unfortunately, there were people who were unable to attend because of time zones or clashes. And so we made a recording and made that publicly available to anyone who wants to access that too. So what you'll find if you visit the Trello board, there's the longer, nearly 1 minute video that is also available on YouTube and widely available. There is a shorter version for use, for example, on TikTok or on other social media platforms, and a range of different short videos that can be used on a number of different platforms. And here I'd really like to extend the thanks to IJPAH for facilitating the translation of many of these videos and GIFs into languages beyond the WHO and the UN official languages. So we've got a small selection of the languages available here, but they're all going to be available through that Trello board. So really thanks to IJPAH and to all the members who provided us with these translations in non-UN languages.
Thank you very much.
So I think we'll finish by just jumping to the last slide, please, Juana. And everyone's asking what's next, of course. So we'll go straight through to what's next and just highlight that, of course, a key phrase has been that the guidelines don't change behaviour. And so WHO, and I hope along with many of you, are really working now immediately into dissemination, encouraging countries to adopt and align their policy, i.e. new guidelines, update guidelines, as Juana already mentioned. But for all of you representing societies like IJPAH, IJBNPA, medical associations, sports medicine associations, align and update your guidelines to be along with the science shown in these WHO guidelines. Advocacy, there's a moment here for using the guidelines for national policy and for investment. And I'm sure there's going to be questions about those two agendas. And of course, informing practice. We use guidelines to inform communication campaigns. I know that will get picked up by a panelist in the journal publications, and surveillance. So they're just the beginning, but it's a milestone. We're absolutely delighted to reach this. We want to talk more about the next steps. We hope there's questions. We hope there's a follow-up series of webinars for this. I'd like to thank, with the last slide, thank IJPAH for the opportunity to just go through the guidelines in a little bit more detail and hand back to Jasper for the moderation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona and Juana. This was a tour de force of the main points of the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior. And with that, I would like to move on to the next part of our webinar program, which, as I said, is the part where three editors will each give us their take on the science behind the guidelines. And we'll start with Manos Stamatakis, the editor of the British Journal of Sports Medicine. Manos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jasper. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from Sydney. I will give you an overview of BJSM special issue dedicated to the WHO guidelines, and in fact put together in collaboration with WHO. Fiona and myself were joint editors. And I should also highlight that this, like the guidelines themselves, this special issue represents, is the outcome, the fruit of a quite monumental effort spanning over 14, 15 months. It involved over 100 people, including authors and reviewers, of course. The main guidelines paper, it's only involved 40 people. And yeah, it took quite a lot of effort, but as with the main guidelines, we're very, very proud of the end result. So I will bridge with Fiona's and Juana's presentation by reminding you once more that these guidelines are not merely advice. They serve a range of important functions. And these functions include scientific consensus, both about what we know and what we don't know about physical activity and health. They serve as implementation tools to decide on the targets for interventions, public health interventions, clinical interventions, further research. They are very important messaging, communication tool on the benefits of physical activity, on the targets of physical activity, and a range of other messages around physical activity. And last but not the least, they're very important for surveillance. So these functions serve were our guide, when we put together this special issue. The majority of the content was commissioned. So we approached authors, we approached teams, and we asked them to write papers about specific issues. And as you can see from the table of contents, we had a very even distribution of the various functions of the guidelines, the relevance of the papers to the various functions of the guidelines. So what I will do in the next few minutes, I would like to give you, I picked up 6 papers, maybe I won't have time to go through them all. I'll have time for 4 or 5, and I will give you a flavor what the papers were about, and then I will pick up one characteristic per paper, one hook per paper. That could be results, that could be methods, could be anything about the paper. Why I think this is an important paper, why you should read it if you have not read it yet, why this paper has a potential to have some impact in our field. And I would like to start by highlighting the editorial by Vicky Lambert and colleagues. This editorial, the main aim was to present the lower and middle income countries' perspective and the many idiosyncrasies, the many particularities that these countries have when it comes to physical activity implementation, interpretation, translation of the guidelines. And the main point, the hook I would like to choose and highlight from this article is the definition of physical activity security the authors provide, which I think is very, it can be, if established and adopted and its use becomes commonplace, I can see this as a very, very powerful advocacy tool, physical activity security, like food security. I provide the definition here. I believe the definition can be expanded, can be refined, and I think that could make a very nice IJPAH project, a very nice IJPAH consensus statement, perhaps, to further refine and improve and establish the definition of physical activity security for use in physical activity advocacy. And I'm moving now to the main guidelines paper. I believe that most of you have already read it. It has, in the first 4 days, it was downloaded, the full text, 45 to 50,000 times. And I dare you to find another paper which within a week from publication has attracted 14 citations already. So these citations are mostly other papers, the papers that Loretta and Hidde will present, but it's still, I think it's an achievement. I was surprised because I didn't realize that we had so many papers on the go, and there were papers which were published concurrently with the guidelines. So yeah, in this paper, you can find the summary of the whole process, the summary of everything, of the guidelines, the process, the methods, the implications for surveillance, the implications for future research. It's a very dense paper, I could be a bit biased, but I think it's very nice to read, very easy to read, flows really well. So congratulations to Fiona, who led the write-up and completion of this paper. And just to give you a clue of the density of the paper. So usually BJSM papers have 2 or 3 key messages. Now in this slide, you can see that there are 10, and these were a summary of the actual key messages, which were about 20 or 30. So a very dense, very heavy paper that we are confident will have a lot of impact. The next paper was the paper Communicated to Messaging, Communications by Karen Milton and colleagues. And the authors here provide a very succinct and very accessible account of what needs to be done, these sequential steps that need to be taken to effectively disseminate the physical activity guidelines, and their work expands and is relevant to physical activity messages in general. So it's not limited to guidelines only. And from that paper, I would like to choose the graph, the flow chart, the process flow chart that that describes the specific steps that need to be taken towards this effective dissemination. So in a nutshell, what I would say that the key message from that paper is know your audience. Know the audience you want to reach, understand their circumstances, and then develop a campaign to disseminate guidelines or physical activity intervention. There was a dedicated paper on surveillance led by Rick Troiano, and I had the fortune to be part of that team as well. And this Rick's paper was described the evolution, the consequences of the evolution over time, of guidelines over time, the consequences for surveillance. Now, surveillance is that function of the physical activity guidelines, but by default gets, every time the guidelines change, by default surveillance will get a little messed up because it will need to adapt. It will need to change measurements. It will need to change the yardstick, the yardstick for counting adherence to the guidelines and all these things. So from that paper, which provides a very thorough overview of previous guidelines, previous generations of physical activity guidelines, and previous models of physical activity surveillance, I would like to pick up and highlight the discussion on the potential of devices for physical activity surveillance. And there are 2 aspects to that discussion. The first is about the role of research-grade accelerometers, research-grade devices, actigraphs and risk-worn device activities and things like that. And the conclusion is that, yes, definitely they do have the potential. Yes, they are the future. But as things stand at this point in time, perhaps we are not ready yet. So device-based measurements, accelerometer measurements could be a very good addition, supplementary to self-report methods. Questionnaires are here to stay, especially if we think about global surveillance, where we will need to ensure that countries, lower and middle income countries as well, have the capacity to implement measurements. Devices cost, they require specialized expertise. They're not necessarily very straightforward to implement in the context of large-scale surveillance. The second highlight I would pick up from this paper is the discussion around the potential of consumer wearables. There has been quite a bit of discussion in the last few years, and in fact, there were some hints in the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, pointing and suggesting that perhaps consumer wearables could be a vehicle for physical activity surveillance. I think it didn't take us much discussion to realize, once we started problematizing it and expanding on this in the paper, it didn't take us much discussion to conclude that that's a non-starter. there is a very long list of reasons: data ownership, changes of devices, interpretation of the data. I don't think that these consumer wearables have much potential. We don't think that consumer wearables have much potential for the purpose of surveillance. And perhaps this will be the last paper to highlight, and I'll skip the last one. This is a paper that addresses by Wolf-Ekelen and colleagues that addresses the joint associations of physical activity and sedentary behavior. And it's an accelerometry analysis, waist accelerometry analysis of 44,000 participants from 4 countries. It's a pool harmonized meta-analysis. And I would like to pick up the key take-home messages from that paper. And I'm extremely glad to be able to link them with the actual WHO recommendation. As you know, as you perhaps know, the WHO, there was a condition of physical activity and sedentary behavior, combined physical activity and sedentary behavior recommendation. So for people who, the very free interpretation of that recommendation is that for people who spend lots of time sitting or lots of time being sedentary, to be correct, the WHO guidelines are about sedentary behavior, not sitting, for equity reasons. For those who spend long periods of time being sedentary, they should aim to exceed the physical activity recommendations, the moderate to vigorous activity recommendations. Now, the Wolf-Ekelen's paper was developed completely independently from the guidelines. These are new data. This paper did not inform the guidelines. However, their conclusions are markedly aligned with the WHO recommendations. The headline finding is that 30 to 40 minutes of MVPA seem to attenuate or even eliminate the association between sedentary behavior and all-cause mortality. So if you multiply those 40 minutes, the upper end of that range, by 7 days a week, we have about 280 minutes. The WHO recommendations are exceeding 300 minutes. And of course, the 30 to 40 minutes in the paper are moderate to vigorous physical activity. The 300 minutes in the WHO recommendation are about moderate intense activity. So there is almost very, very strong agreement between the two. I will skip the last paper because I think I'm already running a bit late, and I'd just like to take the opportunity before I close to thank the large number of people who were involved, authors, reviewers, authors of papers which unfortunately could not make it to the special issue. Fiona Ball, my fellow editor, and the editor-in-chief of BJSM, Karen Khan. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Manos. As you can hear, there is a lot to talk about, and I'm sure everyone would like to hear more about that. But now we're moving on to the next editor-in-chief from the next journal, Hidde van der Ploeg, editor-in-chief for the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. Hidde, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jasper. All right, let's get this set up. All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening, or maybe even night for some people. Very excited to be here, and glad so many people could join us. Of course, I'd like to start with thanking JPAH for initiating this very interesting meeting, inviting me to talk a little bit about papers for IJBNPA. I'd also like to congratulate the WHO on an excellent launch last week that I'm sure many of you attended as well. I have roughly 10 minutes, and like Manos, I probably have much more to talk about than I can in those 10 minutes. So what I've done is that I'll give you a brief overview of all the excellent papers that were published in IJBNPA last week that are linked to the WHO guidelines. And there's a couple of papers where I'll, like Manos, will give a little bit more detail, and you'll see those towards the end. All right, so like Juana said in her presentation, there were quite a few commissioned reviews that were commissioned by WHO to inform the development of the guidelines. Two of those are published with us, others are published with British Journal of Sports Medicine and JPAH. And I'm sure that Loretta will discuss some of that as well. We published the one on osteoporosis and falls prevention. So check those out, I would like to say. We also published a paper on health income inequalities and gender inequalities with regard to physical activity, which is also new data, very much like Ulf Ekelund's paper that Manos was just mentioning. Very interesting paper, and we published a very nice commentary and an editorial as well. Finally, we published 3 papers that came directly from the work from the GDG, the Guideline Development Group. A paper specifically focusing on the guidelines for children and adolescents. A paper specifically on the sedentary behavior guidelines for adults, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. And finally, a paper which is really focused on the recommendations for future research based on all the work that we did for the guideline development. Right, this is an example of one of the tables which I think very nicely illustrates what we were doing, and I think links very nicely to what Juana was presenting earlier. This was from the subgroup on sedentary behavior in adults, and you can see here the different health outcomes that we looked at. This is the paper led by Paddy Dempsey together with the subgroup on sedentary behavior. And next to the health outcomes, we had 4 major questions. So looking at the association between sedentary behavior and the different health outcomes, see if there was a dose-response relationship for those health outcomes and sedentary behavior. Really looking at the interaction between physical activity and sedentary behavior. And then in the end, we also looked at types and domains of sedentary behavior. And you see here the great evidence that Juana was referring to earlier, which in this side is quite moderate. And then you can clearly see that the evidence is really still lacking when we look at specific types or domains of sedentary behavior. Fiona showed this slide as well. It originates from the PACAC report from the US guidelines. A very nice picture, I think. Paddy Dempsey adapted it for this paper. The actual, it's not just a pretty picture, it actually has some underlying data on all-cause mortality and the interaction between moderate to vigorous physical activity, sedentary behavior based on Ulf Ekelund's data. And I think this very nicely illustrates where the guidelines have gone, right? So every move counts. It's not just about vigorous or moderate intensity activity. It's really about everything you do throughout the day and the interaction or the combinations of sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity. I think it very nicely summarizes the key message of the guidelines. The other paper that I'd like to briefly discuss is first authored by Loretta, who will present after me, together with everybody who was in the guideline development group. And here you can see the research recommendations that we set up during at the end of the guideline development. And we split this out. I'm sure you can't read this, and I don't intend you to, but you can clearly see that we split it out in different groups. So we've got some general recommendations, some age-specific recommendations, and then special population recommendations as well. So please have a look at those in the paper. I think key research priorities that we identified for guideline development were the following. So we need more high-quality research on health benefits of physical activity, sedentary behavior across the life course, and those should really focus on the dose-response relationship and the interaction between physical activity, sedentary behavior, the role of light intensity physical activity, and even within light intensity activity, there's quite some difference in different intensities within light as well. So the role of standing, for example, would be quite interesting as well. And like I said earlier, there's a need for better focus on different types and domains of physical activity and sedentary behavior. And of course, the occupational physical activity, occupational sedentary behavior has received quite a lot of attention over the last few years, and it's one of those things that we need to know more about in the future. I think Manos briefly touched on this, but of course, and he was talking about surveillance. This is more about the cohorts and intervention studies, but we need a better sense or better combination in our research between device-based and self-reported measurement. And that interaction between the two measurements, I think, is going to be very helpful. And a lot of our data to date has really been based on self-report still, even though you can see over the last few years, we're getting more and more accelerometer-based data. I think other key research priorities are really that there are huge research gaps still when we look at people living with a disability and or a chronic disease, and much more research should be done there. We'll briefly talk about that in the next part of the program, so I'll leave that for now. And we need to build research capacity really in low and middle income countries, of course, but also in low research contexts across the world. I think Jasper has put on his camera, so I'm assuming I'm running towards the end of it, but this is my last slide, so that's good news. Lots of people to thank, I think. All the authors, all the reviewers, our own editors, of course, IJPAH for organizing, and WHO, of course, and the other two journals. So it's been quite nice to coordinate these papers with JPAH, with BJSM, and please check out our work on the website. Thanks, Jasper.
Thank you very much, Hidde. And again, as with Manos's presentation, much more to be discussed and more to be following as well. Hidde, if you would stop sharing your screen, and then I would like to introduce our next speaker, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Physical Activity and Health, Loretta DiPietro. Loretta, the floor is yours.
Is that okay, Jasper?
Yes, thank you, Loretta. That works?
Yep, works for me. Okay, well, thank you very much, IJPAH, for inviting me to come. We're very proud of our Journal of Physical Activity and Health. I am the editor-in-chief. However, I will be stepping down after 9 years. And in January, Pedro Hillel will take over the helm, and he and I will coordinate the publication of several papers coming from this WHO guidelines development group. So we have a couple of overarching themes in our journal that we try to promote. Obviously, scientific integrity and rigor are important, but we also have some overarching themes of recognizing physical activity and the health benefits in often neglected populations in sectors of the world that generally go unnoticed. We are committed to equity and social justice in the work that people do with physical activity, and where inclusion is also very important to us. And so that was in my mind as I was soliciting papers from the guidelines development group. And as you'll see, our papers will center on disability, frailty, HIV, and communication. So just out in December, is one of the WHO commissioned papers. This was led by Catherine Sherrington and her team, and it concerns the role of physical activity in the prevention of frailty and sarcopenia. It's very difficult to study this topic. Older adults are a special type of people. They're survivors. Studies generally are very expensive to carry out, but the evidence has been tabulated here, and so far the evidence suggests that yes, physical activity does play a role, or probably does play a role in the prevention of frailty and perhaps sarcopenia. Again, it depends when that physical activity is started and the type of program. And these findings really helped us do our work for the older adult subcommittee in formulating the guidelines. So I have the link here if you're interested in this paper. Unlike the previous two journals, we did not have a special issue. It was our decision, the board of the editorial board, as well as myself, that we would space our papers over several months, kind of spread out the love across several times and give people a chance to really present their best work coming from the guidelines. So this paper is out in December. In January, we have two papers coming out. These have been accepted already. The first is the first global guidelines for physical activity and sedentary behavior for people living with disability. We're very, very proud to have gained this paper. This work was led by Catherine Carty and her team, and it's an exceptional piece of work. It's very thorough. There will be a commentary on this very paper in the February edition of JPAH. This paper is not typeset yet. We don't have a preprint, but the other paper is on chronic disease, people living with chronic conditions. Again, as you heard, this now includes HIV. And this work was led by Patty Dempsey. It is now available on the website for you to read. And this was another spectacular and very difficult work to put together. Now in February, we have two more papers coming out, and I can't really talk about them in detail because they are still in review. But the first paper really carries forward the research recommendations and the science between making physical activity and simultaneous or joint sedentary behavior recommendations. And so this paper, I think, is very valuable and will inform future guidelines quite heavily. And the second paper coming out in February will be a review of communication strategies. Karen Milton is involved in this, and I think, as Manos had stressed before, this is important as we work toward scaling up our interventions and we work towards implementation and adoption of these guidelines. Both of these two papers are going to be really key. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Sebi Chastain, who took the lead on the first paper. And then finally, coming out in March, the other WHO commission paper, right? And this will be a umbrella review and meta-analysis of interventions, physical activity interventions among people living with HIV. So I can't really summarize it for you. It's about to go into review, but we're really looking forward to this coming out. So that's all I have. Thank you for your support of JPAH. And I look forward to hearing questions.
Thank you very much, Loretta. And I think that was a very good tag to the next part of our program, a little bit shorter than originally planned, but I would like to hand over now to Dr. Jacqueline Mayer, who will facilitate the Q&A that has been happening on the Q&A button in the bottom of your screens, and we'll take some of the questions live now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper. Some great questions have come through, and thank you to all the speakers for their great presentations. I'm going to perhaps ask the first question to Fiona, and this is a question from Heather, who asks, can WHO extract COVID-specific messages from the global physical activity message in the guidelines?
Thank you, Jackie. What a great question. And of course, all of us have been thinking about that as we've all been affected over the last months. The guideline development process really had parameters set prior to COVID, as you've probably gleaned from Juana's presentation. By the time we managed to meet in person in February, COVID was a seemingly distant and not yet fully understood the magnitude of the issue back then in Wuhan. And so the critical outcome, the immune system, was not included. It wasn't part of our guidelines. Could we have somehow quickly squeezed it in? No, WHO guidelines don't allow that. What I'm pleased to say is that others have picked up that baton, and there are reviews underway, research underway, not only of the relationships to recovery, obviously rehabilitation, and also then even risks and exposure and severity of COVID. We haven't got the opportunity to put them into these guidelines, but WHO does have, under the emergency measures, opportunities for rapid reviews. So we are now ready and interested in making sure we do fulfill expectations around summarizing what evidence there is. So we weren't able to put it in, but it now needs to be our attention globally and for this professional group. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. The next question I'd like to pose to Hidde. Hidde, this question comes from Gemma, who asks, why is multi-component physical activity only recommended for older adults? Is it not beneficial to start that earlier for all adults so that the benefits can be carried through to older age? Hidde.
Very good question, Gemma, I think. Of course, it's good to start earlier with combinations of these things, and so they can track into later life. I think the evidence is really more for older adults. And I think that's where it's there. I've seen Loretta nodding, and Loretta, I think, was in the older adults subgroup, which I wasn't. But do you want to add anything to that, Loretta?
Yeah, Hidde, you're absolutely right. That's where most of the evidence is. And so we both agree with the question. These multi-component activities should be stressed, from day one throughout the life course. They become especially important as people get older, and as they age, we have to up our training as we get older. And so if people have already been doing this type of exercise most of their life, it becomes much easier to do it later in life and stay healthier. So great question.
Thank you both. Loretta, I'm going to stick with you now for the next question, which is a follow-on from Natalie Blakely, who asks, was consideration given to menopausal women and the benefits of physical activity?
Another great question. Yes, in fact, most of the women, it was not a specific sector studied, However, most of what happens after menopause, I mean, it was included in the recommendations. We just did not have a section on menopause, but we, you know, the physical activities mentioned, strengthening, energy expenditure through aerobic or any type of thing really do affect the consequences of estrogen depletion that happens with menopause. So that's why we talk about strength training, right, as well as aerobic activity to serve as countermeasures to the effects of estrogen depletion, the muscle wasting, the fat deposition. We talk about weight-bearing activity for osteoporosis. I believe that was in one of the reviews. So while not mentioning postmenopausal women per se, the recommendations pertain to that period of life.
Great, thank you, Loretta. The next question, please, for Manos. So there are a couple of questions here about whether you have any guidance as to how best to disseminate the guidelines and how we can intervene to increase population levels of physical activity and reduce sedentary time. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you. It's not an easy question to answer because the dissemination and reaching your audience depends on the audience essentially, and so it needs. The main point from Karen Milton's paper is that know your audience before you start planning your dissemination strategy. Know your audience, understand their circumstances, understand what messages they are sensitive to, understand and have an idea what messages will not work in this particular audience, and then draft the communications strategy. The number of steps, I think it's the strategies can be too variable to list them all, but I think the key principle to stick to is tailored messaging, tailored communication to maximize the chance that not only you will disseminate the guidelines, but the guidelines will be uptaken as well. They will be used. It will lead to some behavioral change, improvements, increases in physical activity.
Brilliant, thank you. One more question for Fiona. There's a couple of people who have asked about the measurement of physical activity. And given the changes to the guidelines, how do we approach that then?
Thank you for the question, a very important one. And of course, in our closing session, we'll speak to the need for follow-up on that. But of course, there's implications whenever guidelines are reviewed. It's important then to look at how we communicate on the one hand, but the implications for how we measure. So there are implications which will have larger or lesser effect depending on how a country is measuring it. WHO will look at the global tools, such as for adults, the JPAH, and look at whether the questions and the way the data are analysed and the output actually align, and will develop some forthcoming guidance on that. The same for children. Individual countries that don't use JPAH have their own national data measurement tools will need to do the same. And I'm sure they're going to draw on the scientific community to help them navigate what's important to change and what's not. Some of it will be analytical, some of it might require question change. It's not a small issue, and it's a very important one we address quickly.
Thank you, Fiona. I think we're out of time for questions tonight. Thank you so much to everybody for their excellent questions. There's been a lot of discussion in the chat, and I think you're aware that we're going to follow on with a series of webinars on specific topics relating to the guidelines, in which a lot of these questions will be addressed. But I'll hand back to Jasper now.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for facilitating this. And then I'll hand over to Karen Milton to introduce the next part of our webinar. Are you ready, Karen? cannot see your camera. Yes, there you are. Great.
Hi, thanks, Jasper. Have we got a slide? I think there's a slide to share, perhaps. I think that's with you, Jasper. So I'll wait for you to pull that up. So yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in. And I want to start by thanking all of our speakers, particularly Fiona and Juana from the WHO, who led the whole guideline development process and has supported many of the papers that have been presented tonight as well. And also obviously Hidde, Manos and Loretta as the editors of the key journals in our field. I think one thing that we haven't emphasized perhaps enough is the terminology that was used throughout the WHO guidelines. We've tried to use, Manos did mention this, but we've tried to use inclusive language throughout the guidelines, and that's particularly important to highlight today as it's International Day for Disabled People. So I'd just like to draw attention to that. It's been mentioned several times that the webinar tonight is really an introduction to the guidelines and to the science behind them. I think the guidelines themselves provide an opportunity for us to stock take where we are as a field. We've obviously come on a huge amount since the last guidelines in 2010 that didn't even include sedentary behaviour. So, I mean, we've now got much more knowledge about our field, but I think it's also an important time that we reflect on what we still don't know and where we need to go as a research field over the next few years. So what we would like to do at ISPA is launch a webinar series throughout 2021. We plan to hold webinar series, a webinar probably each month throughout 2021. So what we'd like to do now for the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar is pitch ideas to you for potential follow-up topics. Obviously, there's lots of questions coming in around surveillance, around dissemination, around people with disabilities, etc. So we'd like to plug some ideas for potential webinars. We'd like to get your feedback on what topics you think are most useful or most interesting for us to pick up in the 2021 webinar series. We also invite you to suggest your own topics, and you can do that in the chat function. And also there'll be a further opportunity to suggest topics in the feedback form that's going to be disseminated after this event. So I'm going to invite different speakers to pitch an idea. They've got about 60 seconds to say what topic they think should be covered in a future webinar and why. So firstly, I'm going to pass to Manos.
So I'll give you a very, very quick overview on sedentary behavior. The question I've been asked to address is, do we have sufficient evidence for sedentary behavior guidelines? My 60 seconds pitch. So first of all, I need to highlight that we already have sedentary behavior guidelines. So I guess the question is about quantitative thresholds specific to sedentary behavior. We should acknowledge that sedentary behavior is still a very young field of research. It's a teenager. And as most teenagers, there are insecurity problems, there are immaturity problems. So I think the first step towards the right direction is embrace that immaturity, that insecurity, not to rush and force it, try to put forward quantitative recommendations. Clearly, evidence that comes from devices is the future. I think this is kind of evidence will eventually give us the answers about the thresholds, the maximum sedentary behavior amounts. We should also be mindful and acknowledge that current accelerometry evidence, objective device-based evidence, does not really address sedentary behavior, address stationary behavior, picks up lack of movement, cannot differentiate between sitting and standing, for example. Of course, it's still the best available evidence. So we need measurements that pick up measurement. They can accurately and in a valid way measure posture. My speculation / prediction is I think that we will be moving towards sedentary behavior thresholds that are conditional on physical activity amounts. as a number of recent papers and reviews and meta-analysis, including the Ekelund paper in the BJSM special issue shows. Thank you. A bit more than 60 seconds, perhaps.
That's pretty good, Manos. I was expecting everybody to overrun, so this is fine. Thanks, Manos. We're now going to pass to Fiona, please. Fiona.
Thank you, Karen. You should have a little stop clock for us. But I believe my topic, which I haven't got a slide for, but maybe you do, is going to be the need for a follow-up webinar on the importance of population surveillance. What's needed to advance activity surveillance globally? Why is that important for a topic? Well, we've all heard what gets measured gets done. But let me update that. What is treasured gets measured. And it's high time that the value of physical activity is appreciated. We need to turn good data into information we can use. Countries without data on physical activity are the same ones without a policy and without investment. Now, the surveillance is not the be all and end all, but there is fantastic advances in science around the measurement. We've heard of that. It's in some of the journals, the device-based measures. But how are we going to use them? What are the metrics we're going to use? What age groups are we going to use it for? What are we going to do with the self-report measures? How will we combine them? What about the age groups we're missing? What about people with disabilities on the Day of Disabilities? We have got so many questions, it's so important, and without good data, we will not get the political attention, and we certainly can't hold governments and ourselves accountable. We need a seminar, and we need to advance the science on surveillance.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, we're going to pass to Jasper.
Thank you very much. This is really a speed session. So we've heard that every move counts, but does that move also counts if it happens during work hours? It's a very good question. The evidence seems very inconclusive. Some studies indicate that if you move at work, you move less outside work hours, which might be related to negative health outcomes. Other studies indicate that as long as you move, all seems to be good. We don't know yet. A topic to be discussed further. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasper. I think it's Hidde next. Hidde.
Thank you, Karen. All right, so I think physical activity and sedentary behavior in people with a disability and/or chronic disease is an essential topic for webinar, not just because it's International Day of People with a Disability. People with a disability and/or a chronic disease are more likely to be inactive, and they would often benefit even more than most people from being physically active. With regard to risk for comorbidity, disease management, but also better daily functioning and participation. It's incredibly complex because we say it so easily, people with disability, with a chronic disease, but this is an incredibly heterogeneous group, which has very specific subgroups where that need our attention, I think. And I think it's great that people with disability and people with chronic disease have been included in the guidelines, and I think they should receive much more attention, both in research, in practice, and in policy as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Hidde. I'm now going to pitch an idea. I would like to have a future webinar on how we're going to use these guidelines to change population levels of physical activity. We all know that having the guidelines is important, but what else, what do we need to do with the guidelines in order to make a difference? So who do we need to communicate these guidelines to? What do we need to communicate? Do we need to communicate the guidelines to all audiences, or should we be communicating other messages like every move counts? Also, beyond communication, we know from social marketing that we need to have the kind of policies, the environment, the opportunities to support people to be more physically active. So if our communication is effective in motivating people, the infrastructure is there to support their behaviour change. So I would like to have a really applied future webinar on how we're going to use these guidelines to change population levels of physical activity. Okay, that's my pitch. And the final pitch, last but not least, is from Loretta.
Thank you, Karen. What should we be studying next? There are a few of us in the room that have been in this field of study for more than 30 years, right? We've seen it all. We know physical activity is good. We still have difficulty raising population levels of physical activity. We have trouble scaling up successful interventions to get them to work at the population level. So I would like to see a future webinar on implementation science. How should we be training this next generation of scientists who are interested in physical activity? What are the components of implementation science that work, and how should we be training our people and our communities, our public health practitioners in carrying that out? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Loretta, and thank you to everybody for your pitches. Now, I'm hoping we're going to now have a poll. So thanks, Elroy. A poll should have appeared on your screen. So we would like you to select all topics that you would like to see in subsequent webinars. So please pick multiple options. If you're interested in all of them, tick them all, or certainly tick the ones you're most interested in. Like I said earlier, I'll just reinforce, if there's other topics that you've thought of throughout this webinar, please submit them in the chat function or on the feedback survey that's going to come around after this event. We've signed up for the software now, so we will conduct probably at least 6 webinars throughout 2021, but if the topics keep coming and you keep turning up, we'll keep putting on webinars. So Fiona's messaging to say she can't vote. I think that's because you're a panelist, Fiona. I think panelists are banned from voting for their own topic.
Good. I think, Karen, that we let the poll run so that everyone can have the opportunity to do that while we keep an eye on the time and start to round off.
Sure. Back to you then, Jasper. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to all of you for attending. I have a few closing messages while you're still also completing our poll. Please complete the feedback survey. There is also the option there to provide additional topics you feel we need to include in our webinar series for discussion. If you are not already an IJPAH member, please consider becoming one. There are a lot of member benefits. Stay tuned for more information about our webinar series. As Karen and others have explained, this was only the first one, introducing a lot of the science, showing you there is a lot more to be discussed, which is something we are going to organize during 2021. So stay tuned for more information and dates and times there. Then I should also mention that a recording will become available from this webinar at our the IJPAH website, probably in a day or two. It will be available there for people to listen back. And we will try to also save all the questions and answers and make them available as well. We have to figure out how that works. Technically, this is our first webinar, but I'm sure we can figure it out. And then finally, I would like to end this session by thanking all of our participants for being here online. And then next, of course, thanking all of our panelists for joining us and giving us their time to talk about the science behind the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior. And last but not least, the IJPAH team behind the scenes that has made all of this possible. Thank you very much, and we hope to see